Last week I talked about some of the campaigns that I've run in the past, and I utilized Matt Colville's metric of thinking about your playing group in terms of those players' experience in playing D&D, the type of D&D they play, whether ranging from social to a wargaming style, and the number of players that you have in the group. And part of that discussion, I talked about a one-person campaign that I ran back in the 1990s. Now, in the past, I used to always describe this as a solo campaign because I thought of one player as solo because, D&D, you always have to have a GM and one player. So it wasn't, like solitaire as we considered it in the wargaming days when you would just truly play it by yourself. But, since then I've seen, online folks discussing true solitaire D&D in which there's literally just one player. I haven't looked at this real seriously. I haven't looked at the game film, as they say in football, and partly because, I'm sort of want to always play D&D with another person. But in the spirit of inclusion, I'm going to be calling this one-player D&D. And, I've wanted to talk about this since I started this channel. In fact, I made it one of the goals of my New Year's video, talking about things I wanted to accomplish. But as I got into it, as I started really writing this out and all the things that I've done, or, especially I did in that campaign in the 90s, the thing is, there's a lot of, kind of tricky facets to running a one-person campaign to make it fun. But, you've got to start somewhere. And that last video brought back so many, great memories of the fun that I had in that game. I thought, what? Like so many decisions I've made in my life, whether good or bad, what the hell? Hey gang, KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. So in today's video, I'm going to give kind of a general overview of some of the main concepts of running a single player campaign, and then in later videos, I'll talk in more detail about some of the facets that I discuss. And one major caveat before I get started, the rules of D&D are structured in such a way as to benefit a multiplayer game, right? The character classes, how they're divided, and the mere fact, like in real life, that there are strengths in numbers. In real life, a group of warriors will almost always defeat a single warrior. A gang of thieves will defeat a single cutthroat. But notice that I said almost always because there are two exceptions to the rule of many against one. The first rule is relative power. If the sole combatant is very much more powerful than, all the members of the group, they can win. Let's say a, ninja warrior takes on a group of lowly guardsmen or something. They're going to cut them to the ribbons. And the second exception to the superiority of many against one is when we approach a conflict from a literary perspective. You think about, Conan the Barbarian or James Bond, they are going to win against impossible odds and, unbelievable situations because they are the protagonist of the story. This is the power of the protagonist. We are going to follow them to the end of the story, which means they can't get killed no matter what the odds. And this is where you bring in the idea they get captured, held prisoner, and then they make the near impossible escape. And as you will see, we will use these two concepts, the superiority of greater power and the superiority of the protagonists, in many ways when developing the one-player campaign concept. Now here's another point of order about a one-player campaign. You can try to recreate the standard party that you have in a multiplayer campaign. You could have, two characters of a martial class, a wizard or spellcaster, a cleric for healing, some specialty class like a bard or rogue or something. And what you can do is assign these to NPCs. You can let your player run all the NPCs, or you can let the GM run all the NPCs, or divide them up somehow. And while technically this is a one-player campaign, it's really a hybrid between that and a multiplayer campaign. And like many hybrids, it kind of takes on the weakest aspects of the parts you're combining. Because when you have 5 characters that are running through your wilderness or your dungeon or whatever, it's much more efficient to have 5 players running them. Because when you're in a battle with, 5 characters that one player has to run, it can start to get cumbersome and slow. unless that player is highly skilled, they understand, each of these characters and what they can do, and they're willing to kind of prepare beforehand to run all 5 of these characters. And another aspect that you lose when you have a single player playing all, 4 or 5 characters in a game is you lose the sense of role playing. Because real life players bring their unique personalities, their goals in the game to the table. When you have one player, playing all the characters, again, unless they're very skilled at this, they start to all seem the same. And the other thing is, of course, the favoritism towards their own player. Even if you have the player roll up and run these like 2 or 3 characters as their own, again, that sort of favoritism, whatever, can creep in. And the thing is, if you have the GM, they're going to run all of the NPCs, they'll be objective. Now, the thing is, they got to do all that work, and they have the entire world to run. And the other element here is you've got the GM doing 90% of the action while the single player waits for their single character to do something. So I would suggest that if you're going to run a single player campaign, make it a true solo single player campaign, or just use 1 or 2 NPCs to kind of fill things in. Let the player run them, but also you step in. The NPC's never going to do stuff that would be, life-threatening. We're not going to just use them as their minions. But of course, with that much smaller group, and especially with a single player character against the world, you're going to run into issues of verisimilitude. The game simply isn't designed for having really small parties, much less one single player character survive. But this is where you use the exceptions that I mentioned in terms of the real-world rule of many over one, increasing the power of the single-player character, and also using literary devices in such a way that we can suspend our disbelief. All right, so the simplest way you have to increase the power of a single-player character in a campaign is to start them at a higher level. A first-level character is going to have a much harder time surviving in the world on their own as opposed to a 20th level character. And of course, a 20th level character you're going to presume has collected all sorts of magic items and powers on the way such that, they can survive on their own. But do you want to start at 20th level? I don't think so. Now, you could have a first level character out alone in the world, but you're going to have to give them some sort of, magic item, something, a bonus such that they can survive. And you're going to have to make some intense, literary adjustments that I'll talk about later. All right, so I'll talk in a second here about what level you might want to start your single player in this campaign, but I also want to make a note about in terms of character class. Typically in a multiplayer campaign, I'll just tell players, hey, you pick whatever character you want. Obviously if you're using a rolling method, that can affect things, but like a point buy, let's say, any character you want. Now, sometimes players will tell this person that's entering the campaign, we need a healer. Please be a healer. And they say, I want to be a tiefling monk. They're a tiefling monk. But in a single player campaign, I may push certain classes onto players. Because if a player insists in a single player, I want to be a fighter instead of some kind of spellcaster, this can reduce their chances of surviving unless I start making all sorts of, literary bumps in the world. And this pushing of a certain class kind of points to the unique relationship you have in a single player campaign. You have a single player exploring your world. They're making all the decisions, they're fighting all the battles, they're taking all the risks, but they're also reaping the benefits of that world. They're getting all the treasure or all the adventures. Everything is centered on them. But because of that unique relationship, I say, hey, you got to take a little bit of responsibility if you're going to be the single player and maybe play a class that's more conducive to a single player campaign. It doesn't force me as the GM to make all sorts of, adjustments. Obviously a cleric can do some fighting and they can heal themselves. A wizard has the ability, first of all, to throw, like save or suck spells on enemies or spells that they can use to escape. The bard is the classic, jack of all trades. It has all sorts of these abilities. Whereas a barbarian or standard fighter, again, you're going to have to make some adjustments there. So almost always with a single player campaign, I will really urge them to take certain classes and discourage them with the others. The only time I make an exception if they're a brand new player. Sounds counterintuitive? Well, let me talk about levels and character classes and I'll explain why. All right, so when I think about the starting level for a single player campaign, I usually say either first, third, fifth, or seventh. Those are the basic spell progressions. And the more experienced the player, the higher the level. So a brand new player to the game, I'll say start at first level, You can pick any class you want, and in fact, being a martial class like Barbarian or Fighter might even be easier. And the reason is if it's a new player of the solo campaign, I am going to include a couple of NPCs, 1 or 2, higher levels, rounding things out, and they're going to basically serve to show that player how to play the game. If I start the brand new player at 3rd or 5th or 7th level, they're not going to know enough about the game to be able to utilize that, that character effectively. And I'm going to encourage that new player to make as many decisions on their own as possible, but then sometimes I'm going to have to, push the brake or steer the wheel a little bit so they don't make some catastrophic mistake. And an NPC can really help because they don't want to die either. And I'm also going to use some literary license here with the brand new player such that if they do make, a rookie mistake, I'm not going to punish them as much as I would an experienced player. So again, I'm going to have the experienced player. I want a few classes that I want to do. I'm also going to encourage them if they want to be higher level. Again, if they want to play first level, that's okay. But typically, once you've run a lot in D&D, you tend to want to start a little bit higher. All right, so I'm starting the experienced player at higher 3rd, 5th, or even 7th level. If they want to run truly solo, I'm probably going to give them some kind of magic item or some, ability or something to make their chances of survival greater. And I also might give them a free additional multi-class level. So what this means, if you have a single player who says, okay, I want to be a wizard, a 3rd level wizard, I'll give them an extra level of fighter so that they have the martial proficiencies, they have the hit points, or I give them a rogue level such that they have, cunning escape, something like this. Now, I know there's issues people have with multi-classing in 5e. I totally get those. And in fact, in terms of my playing 5e, tabletop, online, whatever, I notice most people don't even use them because they want to put as many of the points they get into a single class. But in this situation, you're just handing one out at the beginning. Now, suppose you have a player that says, hey, well, instead of being a 3rd level wizard, why don't you just give me that and I'll be a 4th level wizard? No, because the point here is we're running a single player campaign. I'm trying to make their character a little more survivable. Now, again, if they make their character, the typical cleric and they go low on strength or whatnot, well, now they got a fighter with a minus, to hit and all this sort of stuff. You can bump that up to a 0 level if you want. And what you're trying to do when you increase the mechanical power of a player in this way is to try to reduce as many of the literary changes as possible. Now, I also mentioned giving a single player a magic item of some kind to improve their chances of survival. You have to be careful about this with a new player because they still might not be, skilled enough at the game to understand how to use this effectively. Again, what you can do is have that NPC around to sort of explain the item. Now, if you have a 3rd or 5th level single player, you might assume, hey, they've collected some magic items along the way, and also they've got healing potions, this sort of thing. But here's a chance to get creative. Let's say you have a single player that wants to go out in the world on their own, and their parents give them their most coveted magic item to help them survive. The classic is an invisibility ring, but it could be some special amulet that creates tiny hut such that at night they can sleep in this and survive. Now, obviously, an invisibility ring is not something that you would ordinarily just hand out to players when they start a campaign or at 3rd level, kind of a legendary item. You can also reduce in terms of the number of charges it has per day. Maybe it has a limited number of charges, 50 or something that the player knows each time it can't be recharged, but they're using this item as they gain in power in order to survive. And when you have a more experienced player, they might not need, say, a ring of shooting stars or a cloak of displacement, something like this that just gives them that little edge. And the one cool thing about magic items and a single player campaign is you can give out items that you sometimes will not give to a standard, multiplayer party because it unbalances the game. Here you have a structural imbalance, a single character running in the world that you are balancing with the magic item. So the other method that I mentioned in terms of balancing the power of the many over one is the literary method. This is the way you are unfolding your storylines, you're unfolding the encounters in such a way that a single character out there could survive. And the most obvious way is to simply scale the encounters. We have to suspend our disbelief a bit here. How much sense does it make for a single orc or 2 orcs to be out in the wilderness? Well, it makes sense when you only have 1 player character. Traditionally at lower levels, you might have giant animal encounters such that, the players can, sort of practice that. But especially if you have a new player to the game, The issue there is, they don't have very interesting attacks. They don't use battle tactics. A single orc or something, on one-on-one can be very interesting for that new player. The other thing is you got to be careful with is, when you have one character or maybe you have one or two NPCs with them, the save or suck spell can really turn disastrous. So even if that, NPC or that monster or whatever has those kind of spells, you may want to avoid that because otherwise you're going to have to come up with some explanation for how they get out of that. Because in a single player campaign, there's only one saving throw. So another great literary technique for the unfolding of your storylines and encounters is to run city and town adventures, because this is an environment where actually people do kind of move around by themselves. And so for a beginner or low-level, first-level character that's running, they just have a task. Maybe they have to deliver a message to some NPC, or because they are new in town or whatever, they attend a secret meeting to find out some information about plans. And obviously the city and town environment is really where the rogue and bard character class shines. And of course the nice thing about a city or town adventure, you don't have to worry about where the players are spending the night. You give them a base of operations, where they stay. You can also have that solo player, if they're first level, they've grown up in this town, which means they have a network of friends and enemies such that they can have tasks, NPCs that ask them to do things. The NPC mentor, I mentioned mentors in another video. They can provide tasks, they can give them information, they can also provide healing spells and whatnot. Maybe the player character owes a favor to the NPC in terms of their family relationships, or maybe vice versa. And of course that NPC could be scrying on the first level character that they've sent out to do some task, such that if the player gets captured or whatever, they can come to the rescue. Because another classic literary technique, we see this in Conan or James Bond or whoever, is to capture instead of killing. And of course, a solo player in terms of escaping can often be easier than, in terms of sneaking out or whatever, than a group of player characters. And of course, this is where the sorcerer, warlock, bard class has an advantage in terms of using spells to escape, because they don't need their books, which can often be taken away from the wizard if captured. And along with that capture rule comes another literary device, which is, if a single player character goes down below 0 or whatever, the NPCs who want to, use them for something will stabilize them, will prevent them from dying. And the final tool that I'll talk about is kind of literary and mechanic at the same time, which is to augment or replace standard experience with either story-based or, session-based experience points. Especially if you're scaling encounters or you're having players do, missions in a city or collecting some item or getting some information, they may not be racking up points in the standard way. Now, of course, you can also not divide experience with NPCs, and so this will give them more points. But if you find you're not tracking to what you usually know, however many sessions you're running, the solo player is not getting the points that would ordinarily be given, then you can just hand them out for those things. But you have to be careful here, because if you have a new player and you're just giving out, experience points based on them sort of surviving each session, they get up to 3rd or 5th level, and they're not experienced enough to really understand, the ramifications. They haven't been able to play their characters long enough to learn the game. All right, so those are some of the basic concept of running a single-player campaign, and I use those two, basic general rules of power and literary license to overcome some of the problems you encounter when running with one player in a game structurally designed for multiple players. In later episodes, I'm going to talk about things like your storylines, your encounter designs, specialized magic items, and specialized NPCs that you can use that will also augment the concept of having a single player in your campaign, such that there is some verisimilitude there. You're not stretching the suspension of disbelief, and you're having fun. But until then, if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. I love to read them. But most importantly, keep playing D&D, this game we all love, and tell somebody else about it.